In November 1920, a stranger arrived at Sunnyside near Cullen in Moray. Charles Marione, or Marioni, or even Marconi, would go on to live there for the next 13 years. Charlie was an affable man, and the locals came to like him, as did tourists, but he refused to tell them anything about himself or his past. On a postcard sent in 1929, one tourist wrote about the man living in the cave at the bay, calling it a cave house, which had been naturally formed at the bottom of the cliffs. She went on to say that he lived on fish that he'd caught and grew vegetables on small patches of ground. This piqued interest in the Cullen Hermit. In the summer of 1932, a journalist with the Aberdeen Press and Journal visited Charlie. The first thing Jean M. Gordon saw was smoke rising out of a rock, as she put it. She then noticed small patches of cultivated land, where there was a tiny plot of potatoes, along with other vegetables, growing in small enclosures. Charlie had brought soil down from the land at the top of the cliffs, but it had been a slow and laborious process. He'd built a low fence and outlined a path with white stones. The rock house was south-facing, with the cliffs giving shelter from the wind. Tarred wood washed up on the shore had been used to extend the shelter, which had a porthole-type window, and there was a small pane of glass in the door. He'd also used an old stovepipe to act as a chimney. He made simple furniture using driftwood, so may have had some knowledge of carpentry and construction methods. Charlie looked after himself, washing regularly, and his clothes were always clean. His accent couldn't be placed, but he invited the journalist and her companion into his little house, saying, "Come away, come away." His little cave house was kept clean, neat and tidy. At its entrance were a few coloured prints stuck on the whitewashed walls, with the floor being dusted in sand. The extension or cabin was to the right and housed a cosy bunk with a thick grey blanket to keep him warm. There was also a built-in stove, a shelf with a clock on it, and all the ingenious contrivances of a sailor's den. This perhaps was influenced by his time at sea, although, as already mentioned, he never spoke of his past, except for this slip-up. She discovered that he did his own cobbling, mending, and could make candles and soap. He told her that he was in good health, thanks to his simple lifestyle. He ate fish and his homegrown vegetables, and also made his own bread. To make a store for winter, he would dry the fish and make preparations for storing his vegetables. Near Christmas, he always received cards and gifts, and kept a box filled with these cards, which he showed to a few of his favoured visitors. They were postmarked from Edinburgh to Canada. Such was his impact on those who met him. In another box he kept photographs of himself and some visitors, one of whom was James Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister between 1929 and 1935, standing in a group at the Hermit's door. Charlie didn't read newspapers or books, perhaps meaning he couldn't read, or possibly not read English, but he claimed he could speak 5 languages. Asked which one was his native tongue, Charlie shut down and showed some hostility regarding the question. Another person who encountered Charlie was John Moray from Milltown of Rothiemay. In 1925 he'd come across him and had ascertained he was a Welshman by birth and had been a deep-sea sailor since boyhood before becoming a hermit at Cullen. He'd sampled his homemade bread during his visit, which had been freely given. Moray never asked him how he'd ended up living as a hermit. He went on to say Charlie supplemented his diet by procuring provisions from the town of Cullen. Mrs. Gordon later stated that a Welshman had greeted Charlie in his native tongue once and had drawn a complete blank, making him more intriguing. To make a living, Charlie sold postcards to tourists, although these were priced higher than the same ones sold in the shops in Cullen. He also sold some of his fish that he caught and rabbits that he snared. In some of the postcards, he would be posing with his fishing rod, whittling or even playing his fiddle, his most prized possession. Soon word got round and Charlie began to become quite famous. He was even mentioned in the 1931 Cullen Guidebook and appeared in an article in the local Banffshire Journal newspaper on 15th August 1933. All this attention, however, culminated in him being arrested. On Friday, 25th August 1933, he appeared at the Sheriff Court in Banff before Sheriff J.W. Moore, charged with being an alien with a registered address in Pembroke, and that he'd failed to report his arrival to the registration officer for Banffshire within 48 hours. This was a legal requirement in the Aliens Order of 1920. Instead of contesting in court, Charlie admitted the charges and was fined 20 shillings, an old pound. He'd only been brought to the attention of the magistrates as a complaint had been made that a large number of people had been visiting him and had been constantly disturbing cattle belonging to Mrs. Moray. They had also heard that he'd been breaking up and cultivating pieces of ground. During his court appearance, Charlie told the sheriff that he would leave Cullen and head to Leith, where he would register. With the little money he had, it was also his intention to return to France, the sheriff having spoken to him in French and him replying in it. Finally, the mystery of where he'd come from had been solved. His name was also given as Charles Marconi. The prosecution in the case asked for him to be imprisoned until arrangements had been made for him to return to the continent, but the defence said it would be a calamity to imprison him, saying that he'd never begged, borrowed or stolen anything during his time in his cave and had never done any harm to anyone. The sheriff told him to report to Leith police station and take the first boat back to France. Charlie left his home soon after, drowning his cat before doing so as he couldn't take the animal with him. It had been his constant companion during his time at Sunnyside. It's known he arrived in Leith, and it was his intention to get a boat to London to see the French consul before he could re-enter France. Once old Charlie, as the locals affectionately called him, had left, it was said that the tenant farmer burnt his home, and its blackened walls can be seen to this day. What became of the Cullen Hermit is unknown. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.